Unmute. Okay. Sorry about that. Welcome back, everybody, to the 2021 Virtual PLC Legislative Conference. We're so glad to have you all here, and we're really excited for all the information that we'll be able to share in the question and answers for these different sessions. This session features a panel discussion on grazing's role in the climate conversation, which, as we all know, is becoming front and foremost right now. My name is Brenda Richards, and I am a past president of the Public Lands Council. I currently serve as the Public Lands Council treasurer. We ranch on a cow-calf operation in Owyhee County in Idaho, and I'm also currently the coordinator for the Idaho Rangeland Conservation Partnership, which brings in much of the different things we've been talking about today with different organizations, different land users. And this is one of the conversations that we are front and center on right now. So I'm excited to be able to facilitate this panel. Joining us for this discussion today is Dr. Barry Perryman, Dr. Jason Sawyer, and Dr. John Tanaka. So first I would like to introduce Dr. Barry Perryman. He's no stranger to the Public Lands Council. We worked with him on a number of things and really appreciate all of you, but appreciate getting to see you again, Dr. Perryman, on this panel. Dr. Barry Perryman is a range expert at the University of Nevada, Reno. He's is a professor and department chair for the Department of Agriculture, Veterinary, and Rangeland Sciences. Dr. Perryman received his bachelor's degree in agronomy from the Abilene Christian University and received his master's and doctorate degrees in rangeland ecology from the University of Wyoming in Laramie. Welcome, Dr. Perryman.
Thank you.
Okay. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Jason Sawyer, who was raised in and around Central Texas and still has deep family roots and the family place in McCulloch County. He received his bachelor's degree in rangeland ecology and ranch management from Texas A&M University in 1995, and a master's in ruminant nutrition in 1998, and a doctorate, a PhD in range nutrition and beef cattle management in 2000, both from New Mexico State University. Dr. Sawyer joined the faculty at the Clayton Livestock Research Center in Clayton, New Mexico, with a joint appointment in both research and extension as a beef cattle extension specialist. Jason joined the team at the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management, acronym KRIRM, in January 2020 to expand the opportunities for that institute to create innovative solutions for ranch management. So welcome, Dr. Sawyer. We very much appreciate having you on this panel.
I'm privileged to be here today. I just hope I can keep up with the caliber of my colleagues on the panel.
No worries. And also, we would like to welcome another friend to PLC who's not a stranger to our meetings. Dr. John Tanaka is a professor emeritus for the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the University of Wyoming and a researcher for the Sustainable Rangelands Roundtable. Dr. Tanaka's research focuses on the economic impacts of various public land management options on Western ranches, economics of ecosystem goods and services, the economics of rangeland management practices, and related activities. Dr. Tanaka is currently working on a national assessment of rangeland sustainability, which is using existing data to populate the Sustainable Rangelands Roundtable indicators of sustainability. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention one of Dr. Tanaka's good friends in crime, Dr. Neil Rimby. They have also worked on economics here locally for our county commissioners for a number of years for the grazing factors, and we appreciate all that work and look forward to the conversation. So welcome, Dr. Tanaka.
Thank you, Brenda. I'm kind of like David Wilms in your last panel. I put a tie on. I forgot how to tie one. It's been so long since I retired and put one on, so I left it on.
Yeah. I see Dr. Perryman has his tie on too. So
Yeah. Says once a cowboy, always a cowboy.
anyway, thank you all for joining us, and let's get started with this. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started with this discussion. Because I am joining you from out here in Owyhee County, I am going to stop my video to make sure that we can keep things moving forward, and would like to get this started off with a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll get into some questions. So an introduction, kind of a summary here for the panel. As Christians for many, many years about soil health and improving range conditions and keeping open spaces and supporting robust plant diversity. And I think one of the things that hits me right now more than anything, we've come through a really unique year in our lifetimes. And we here in the Treasure Valley outside of Boise are one of the fastest growing places in the nation, which is a little bit disturbing for us, because as we're talking about open space, a lot of what we're seeing is pasture land and farm ground, but it's also affecting our rangelands. So this conversation could not be more timely and more important as we move forward. We've talked about nitrogen retention or addition, increasing the organic matter, and we've even talked about carbon storage over the years. These conversations have certainly accelerated, as I just stated, over the last several years, and especially within the last year, and especially with the conversations going on with the new administration. It now seems they've reached actually a fevered pitch. And so as we're talking about climate, carbon storage, carbon sequestration, emissions potential, and modeling like never before, and again, as I stated, especially with this new administration, these conversations seem to permeate regulation, legislation, consumer marketing, and certainly those of us that are on the land. It is, for some of us, all-consuming and maybe a little bit frightening, but I also am very optimistic and think that we have a tremendous opportunity here and a great story to tell and a role to play for what we do. All of you have worked in this space for many years and have seen much of the evolution, not only in terminology, but in the conversation. Like us, you have also seen shifts in public sentiments, and I'm sure you're very aware, as we talked on our last panel, about a lot of the multiple uses out there and the increase in those uses. You've also seen shifts, though, in the scientific focus and the academic perspective too, and that's why we appreciate so much everything you all bring to this panel. So the first question I'd like to pose to each one of you is, you have a very captive audience here today with permittees from across the West. And if there would be one thing that you could tell them, maybe to help alleviate a little bit of our fear, but also look for the opportunities that may be there, what would you tell them about the current discussions revolving around climate, carbon, rangeland health factors, in contributions of livestock grazing? And go ahead, Jason. We'll go ahead and start with you.
Well, you know, I think you've kind of set the stage pretty nicely. Certainly there's maybe more conversation happening at more levels about grazing on rangelands in the United States today than there has been in the last 30 to 50 years. Unfortunately, not all of it has the tone that I might prefer that it had. And so if there was one or two really key thoughts that I would want to share and discuss with, you know, fellow grazers and permittees, it would be the open conversation that's occurring now is maybe the best opportunity for grazing stewards of rangelands to make their case than has existed in some time. Not because the ground is so fertile and people are going to be so receptive to perhaps a dissenting viewpoint from the one that they currently hold, but because the conversation is occurring and there are positive stories to tell. I think that as our understanding of ecological systems continues to evolve, and more particularly as this conversation about the relationship between land use and environmental health continues to unfold, I think that there is, again, a tremendous opportunity to tell a positive story about the role of livestock grazing in land stewardship. And I would encourage people who are directly affected by these conversations to be positively vocal. I fear that often I myself have been much more defensive than necessary and felt the need to defend grazing practices from a perceived attack, rather than to tell a story and communicate effectively about how grazing contributes positively to ecological systems, and perhaps importantly to help reframe the understanding of, you know, what has historically been perceived as negative impacts, or you know, that livestock grazing on Western rangelands is some sort of an invasive practice, right? A non-historical use or unsuited for the landscape. And I think certainly that the opportunity exists today for us to reframe that conversation to be more positive. And I believe that if we can be effective in having that conversation in the current policy environment and public framework of conversation, that we can have positive impacts and perhaps come to a clearer understanding, help the consuming public of the United States have a clearer understanding of what the real role of livestock grazing is in these systems, and how it adds significant value to rangelands, not just in their economic place in agricultural production, but in multiple use, multiple ways in the delivery of ecosystem services and long-term stability of these systems. So I guess that, you know, to sum it up, my message is it feels like an attack, but I think that we have a very positive conversation to have. And if we address it positively, there's perhaps tremendous opportunity at hand.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. I couldn't agree more. It's really easy for us to get on the defense because a lot of times we find ourselves doing that with other things, but I'm excited about the opportunity that's here, and I think we've got a really good story to tell. So Dr. Perryman, let's go to you and see what you have to say, your one message on this great big huge topic for your audience.
The one message. I am really hopeful and optimistic that much of the talk and emphasis about science with this administration is an actual dedication to it. If it is, we got a story to tell, a good story to tell, and we've got a lot of good new science that should, in any reasonable forum, counteract some of the things that have been going on for the last 4 decades or more with respect to livestock grazing infrastructure on both public lands and private lands. And we have to begin really thinking about the grazing process as a tool to achieve ecosystem outcomes. I want to talk about outcomes, and we've not managed that way before. We've not managed that way in the past, and I'll get into it here in a little bit. But but the grazing infrastructure that's on the ground on both public and private lands, and those need to be better coordinated probably than they have been over the last several decades. But the grazing infrastructure that's on the ground, it's not dependent on the vagaries of annual federal budgets or state budgets, like herbicides would be in the case of invasive species. So if we just use invasive species sort of as a model for talking about this, you can't spray the world with herbicide simply because you don't want to do that in the first place. And secondly, there's not enough budget on an annual basis to really maintain those kinds of projects. But that grazing infrastructure is out there. The permittees are out there, the private landowners are out there, and as long as it's economically viable, that infrastructure's out there and it doesn't cost the taxpayer anything, and or very little in some cases. And that can provide a tool that's just on a landscape scale that has no rival when it comes to things like invasive species and some of these other ecosystem services that we're beginning to talk more and more about with respect to for instance carbon sequestration and CO2 release. And fires and all those things surrounding that. So that would be my one thing is I'm optimistic that it's good to hear people talking about science. And we've got science, and open up and we'll feed it to you. So I'm optimistic about that.
Thank you, Dr. Perryman. And there's two words that really were just music to my ears and salve to the heart, and that's landscape scale across ownership boundaries and outcomes, because we're already everybody gets hung up on outcome-based management, but we make decisions for outcomes anyway, so the science will guide us. So I think with Dr. Sawyer's comments about opportunity and your comments about science, and that sets the stage well. And Dr. Tanaka, I will turn it over to you for your one message. And I know Dr. Perryman hit on ecosystem services, and I know that's taken a lot of your time in the last few years. So tell us what you see with this opportunity here.
Yeah, kind of like my Jason and Barry, it's like one message is kind of hard to do here. So, and I agree with everything they've said. What I would focus a little bit more on is just where you're going with your own personal operation and how it fits in that large landscape. I tend to look at, grazing management, how it's done, economics for your operation, and then how it all fits in with your family and community goals. When you look at all three of those things together, how you monitor, how you adapt your operation to changing climate, changing weather patterns, how you can make your ecosystems more resilient to those kinds of changes are going to be important, and being able to tell those kinds of stories to people that aren't out on the land so much and that are making policy are going to be important. So I'll just leave it at that, since they already said everything else.
Well, that sounds good. And I guess that'll put us right in too. I like what you said about the fact that you have to look at the ranch as a unit, whether you run on just private, on public lands as we're talking here, or incorporate some state leases. It all has to be a landscape scale, and that ranch has to work as a unit. So with that, Dr. Perryman and Dr. Sawyer, I'd like to shoot a question to you, and then Dr. Tanaka, if you'd like to jump in, that'd be fine too. But what I'd like to give the audience here is, let's set a baseline. So could you each give us a brief rundown of how grazing can be used to increase the soil health and the ability to store carbon? So Dr. Perryman, we'll go with you first, and then we'll head over to Dr. Sawyer, and then Dr. Tanaka, if you'd like to jump in, that'd be fine too.
Well, I like using examples, and one great example of how we can affect, I believe, how we can affect soil carbon and the flux of soil carbon is certainly through the grazing process. And I go back to this concept of invasive species as an example. The stuff that you see behind me here, of course, is cheatgrass, most of it, and it's a very shallow-rooted plant. And what we would like to do in most cases is we would like to increase the amount of deep-rooted perennial grasses on some of these ranges, as opposed to more annual invasive grasses. And so, deep-rooted perennial grasses in much of the Intermountain West are the keystone species. They are the species that holds the ecological pathways together. And so if we pay attention to the health, and I really don't like that word because it's so hard to define, what's healthy and what's not healthy. But if we pay attention to the welfare or the health of our deep-rooted perennial grasses, we're going to store more carbon deeper in the soil, and we're not as likely to burn it all up and set it loose into the atmosphere. And so that's just one example, that most of us are familiar with. And of course, the way that we graze things, timing, duration, and intensity can make a whole lot of difference in what the balance of power is on some of our ranges in the Intermountain West, the balance of power between invasive annuals and deep-rooted perennials. And so we can have a say as society in the size and the severity of burns and the release of carbon into the atmosphere and the storage of carbon in the soil. If we take a look at it in terms of outcomes and look at it at a landscape scale, we have the ability to really have a say. We're not going to fireproof anything, but we can at least have a say in when it might burn and how large it might burn and how intensively it might burn. So I'd rather have a say in it than just, be a subject of the vagaries of nature and not necessarily nature, but some of the conditions that we've created over the last 40 years or so. I don't like being a victim. I'd rather get out in front and try and use the grazing infrastructure in a way that promotes the storage of carbon and decreases the release of carbon into the atmosphere. So I don't know if any of that made any sense, but I think I got back to where I started. So.
No, I think you made perfect sense, especially to those of us who live in areas that can go up in smoke real quickly. So Dr. Sawyer, what would your take be on this question?
Well, I'm going to try pretty hard not to repeat too much. I think if you have several fairly like-minded folks responding, then there's the risk that we all say the same thing. So I'm going to try to avoid that, but I might want to start, said kind of what's a baseline or first principles, you might say. And one thing that I think is a really important conversation to have is that in most studies that I would say that I think are reliable in terms of their duration and location and degree of control and comparisons, grazing I'm not talking about a particular strategy or system, but grazing compared to non-grazing typically improves soil carbon. And so, and I think that there is a deeply held conviction amongst persons, and I'm going to say that's, you know, an uninformed opinion perhaps, that all grazing is detrimental to, you know, soil health or soil organic matter. Use a metric of your choice there, when in fact only under the most extreme circumstances would we see really significant reductions that are a consequence of grazing. And most of the time that's when the grazing pressure is such that it results in significant soil loss. And so I think that with good stewardship, grazing in general should be viewed as positive if our outcome of interest is soil carbon storage, you know, for greater than a year. I mean, so I'm talking about below ground, then grazing in general is a positive influence on that. And now we can think about, you know, again, in the context of outcome-based management, if we have to have economic viability, otherwise grazing is infeasible, right? Unless somebody's going to pay you to graze to achieve some other objective. But in and of itself, economic viability of a grazing operation and an operator's desire to persist over time, in other words, I'd like to stay in business, then those things both lead themselves to a motivation or an incentive within the firm to manage grazing in such a way as to promote long-term productivity. And so the promotion of long-term productivity, again, across all grazing strategies, and this again echoes Dr. Perryman's comments where, you know, use of grazing to shift from short-lived, shallow-rooted annuals to deep-rooted, more resilient perennial systems certainly connotes the achievement of longer-term stability in operation, and also results in greater below-ground storage of carbon. So I think that, you know, first and foremost, we need to recognize that grazing is a positive influence if that is the outcome of interest. And secondly, that encouraging or allowing producers to operate in a manner that allows them to be profitable over the long run is most likely to provide incentive for them to manage grazing in such a way as to achieve the carbon goal. So these things don't operate independently, nor do they operate at odds. And too often I think that the public context of this conversation is positioned as grazing versus environmental health, when in fact, environmental health as a result of grazing is probably a better frame for us to have the conversation in.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Dr. Tanaka, is there anything that you would like to add to this on the question as setting a baseline on how grazing can be used to increase soil health and store carbon?
Yeah, I'll add just a couple things. So we've been working on some of the economics of soil health on ranches. We had a couple students doing research on that. And what we found is that we know very little about the long-term impacts of grazing from a research perspective. And so we've had to make some assumptions, and basically the assumption is however you define soil health, and Barry mentioned that, is, you know, how do you define it and what do you measure on it? But the assumption is that if you increase soil health through grazing or a change in management, trying to figure out how it affects forage quality and quantity, duration of growth, those kinds of things becomes very difficult. And with the current level of research, we've started some long-term research in Wyoming before I retired that hopefully the research center will continue to do. But again, it's at one location, a couple different grazing systems approach, and so it might provide some additional information. But again, from a research perspective, we just don't know a whole lot about how changes in management are going to affect soil qualities in the long term and how long it takes to affect that change in a positive direction. So that's I guess as a baseline, just one of the challenges we have from the research perspective, and probably a bigger challenge for you guys that are producers trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I appreciate you bringing that into this conversation. So now that we've got that set, let's move a little bit forward into terminology, because that's extremely important when we're talking about livestock and their interaction with different kinds of ecology. And it seems like this terminology, sometimes I think it changes month by month, but it does change over time, certainly. And there still are a few terms that have made it through time and endured contemporary conversation. And all three of you have done a lot of work around the concept, and I'm going to use air quotes here because Dr. Perryman, I heard you talk about health, but sustainability is one of those words that, that's why I'm using air quotes, but that's a word that gets thrown around a lot and seems to have gone through the test of time. So from the perspective of a rangeland manager and as a producer in a community, we all have heard that word a lot. So when we're talking about grazing's role in the entire scheme of rangeland management, carbon storage, and the climate, do you think we should be focusing on sustainability and its key tenets, or do we need to be having conversations that are using other terms and considering other factors? And Dr. Tanaka, I'm going to go to you first.
Okay, so I'll just answer with yes. But really, it's, when I talk about sustainability, it's trying to balance ecology, economics, and social aspects of both the individual ranch, but of the community, the region, the nation as a whole. You'd mentioned, Brenda, that I've been working on this national assessment as part of the Sustainable Rangelands Roundtable. That's been a 20-year process to get to where we're almost having the first draft of a national assessment using existing data. And it's something we struggled with for a couple of years now of, talk about balance, and, I came up with a way to show that, but you can still be balanced at a really low level of all three areas, or you can be balanced at a really high level. And so what does balance mean? And really what I think it leads to is more of a conversation of what do you mean by sustainability? What are you going to measure? How do we talk about the same set of data from different perspectives? And that's been the challenge. At the ranch level, I know you're familiar, and several of the others on the call are as well, this guide for sustainable ranch management that we help facilitate with agencies, ranchers, and academics and others. But to me, that's really just a guide on how to have a conversation about your own operation from all of these different perspectives, and try to figure out where your weaknesses are, where you can do things better. Climate, carbon storage, those kinds of things all fit into that conversation. And it's not just one or the other, it's how do you make all three of those factors fit together when you talk about sustainability? Because it is a word that's just fraught with personal values. And so, and I'll just throw it out, the example I always use is the spotted owl in timber harvest in Western Oregon when I lived out there. And you have, if you collect data on timber harvest, it just fell off the edge of the table when the forest plan went into effect. And if your personal value is, you thought that reducing all timber harvest was good for the spotted owl, you probably look at that and say that was good. If you're a logging family, that was the most devastating thing ever. There's now no more timber harvest. And so then that's the problem with sustainability and looking at the sort of data that we've been looking at lately. So I'll leave it at there and see what my colleagues have to say.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tanaka. So Dr. Sawyer, I guess I would throw the same question to you. Do you think we should be focusing on sustainability and the key tenets around it, or do we need to be having conversations using other terms and other factors?
Well, so this is a difficult thing, and part of the reason that the term sustainable or sustainability has itself been perpetuated, right? The term itself has become sustained. Is in part, I think, because it's so loosely defined, and so almost any individual or group or can to some degree define the term for their purpose. That makes it really difficult to have a transparent conversation with others unless you initiate the conversation with a definition of sustainability, and maybe that's what we need to do. Our tendency has been to think, I tend to be a literalist, right? Like, I think words should have a meaning and we should stick to that meaning, and I don't always get my way, but that's a conviction that I have. And so I think that as we try to remain engaged in a discussion about what sustainability means, that we recall that it does at the very least carry a connotation of continuance. And so future viability is maybe a way to think about that. From the firm perspective, and at the King Ranch Institute, we're obviously quite interested in ranch management, and we view the sustainability of the ranching operation as being grounded in economic viability, but that economic viability is to some degree conferred by resource stewardship. In other words, if I want continuing or successive generations to be able to successfully and economically operate the ranch, then there is an indication there that the resource base can't be degraded to a point where it can no longer support operations. And that as we participate in our communities and provide, in the state of Texas, property taxes drive much of the, rural community and county governance. And so as we make contributions to our community, both socially and financially through taxation, that the economic value and viability of these lands is important for the long-term stability of those communities. At the same time, we sell a product. And so again, in the context of livestock operations, we market a product that ultimately is consumed as a food product or as other co-products of that production stream. And society grants us to some degree social licensure to operate through their willingness to purchase our products. And we have to at least recognize that, to me, circling back to your first question, this is an important part of the conversation. Let's not lose sight of the fact that we produce goods and services that are valued by consumers. And so, lastly, I think that with regard to the term sustainability, about 20 years ago now, there was a group that was quite interested in the term sustainability from an accountancy perspective. And so this was during the genesis of, triple bottom line accounting and sort of corporate reporting with an effort or an aim, I guess before ESG, right? But with an aim to providing public reports, for publicly traded companies about corporate responsibility. And in the development of some of those processes, they struggle with this same problem, right? What does this sustainability really mean? And a group of authors made a statement in a manuscript that has really stuck with me and resonated, is that sustainability is a forecasting problem. Like, by definition, how do I know if the things I do today are sustainable? If they are, then that implies that the future, that I'll still be able to do them in the future, which means that with any management action, its effect on sustainability is a forecasting problem. And our ability to forecast certain things, back to Dr. Tanaka's comments, even about the long-term impacts of certain management decisions on environmental aspects or, quote unquote, environmental health, means that we have a really significant forecasting problem if we want to make a claim that something is sustainable. With that said, I don't think we can not use the term. I think that the public conversation has grasped that term, and that for us to attempt to avoid its use is to our disadvantage, not to our advantage, but that perhaps we should make every effort to clarify and define what we mean when we talk about sustainable practices. And that we not apologize for the necessity for ranches to make a profit in order to confer these other benefits and the other sort of dimensions or axes of sustainability as it's commonly interpreted. And that we not be apologetic for the economic viability component of sustainability, whether at the firm level, the community level, or contributions to the GDP of the United States. However, at whatever level we wish to have that discussion, I don't think we should be embarrassed about it or shy away from it, I suppose. But we should also recall that we do have a forecasting problem. And when others proclaim a forecast about a practice, right, they say that is not sustainable. That we should also be prepared to challenge their implicit forecast there if in fact we believe we have data that counters it. So I'm not really an apologist for the term sustainability, but I don't think that we can not use the term. We just need to be thoughtful about how we and make sure that we're defining it clearly almost each time we enter into a conversation about it, because others may not be defining it in the same way.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer, and I couldn't agree more. There's a couple of things that both you and Dr. Tanaka talked about. Sustainability and talking about the future goes hand in hand, but also you cannot divorce the excuse me, the economic, ecological, and social aspects, because the social is our thriving rural communities. So I appreciate hearing that from both of you. And Dr. Perryman, would like to hear the same thing for you. What do you think about the term on sustainability and its tenets? And do we need to be having conversations with other terms and considering other factors?
Well, I'll tell you what I know, and I'll tell you what I don't know. And there's more that I don't know. For a number of years now, I've been pushing this idea, or wanting people to start talking about this idea that's wrapped up in sustainability. And I don't know if it's as definable as sustainability or not, or even like sustainability, even if it's sort of indefinable. But I like this approach where I want to do management that maintains my options for the future. And those options, they may be different options, but they may cause you to be sustainable into the future. You may be doing something different. I don't know, maybe if you had the option to change from a cow-calf operation to a steer operation, it would be nice to have that option. But if you don't have that option, you can't change from one to the other. And so one of the things that I always fall back on as an example of this, and this is more of a direction for the conversation to go rather than an answer, I guess. And that is, late season brood habitat for sage grouse. Once again, back to an example. If we manage ecosystem processes, if we really try to manage them, for instance, if we try to manage fire on these late season brood habitat areas, or pick any other sage grouse habitat seasonal habitat that you prefer. If we try to manage fire in those areas instead of keeping it out or allowing it to just burn, all of it to burn up, if we protect it instead of managing it, those brood habitats, eventually we know what's going to happen. Eventually we're going to get a catastrophic fire and it's going to burn it all up. Well, what kind of options do we have at that point? We don't have much. But if we try to manage fire, and we can manage fire through managing the fuel loads, we can manage fire in an ecosystem through actually, putting fire into the system, setting a few controlled burns, etc. Most of us understand those kinds of things. If we try to manage fire, then we've at least maintained our options for the future. And I think that's where the conversation needs to go. Is outcomes that maintain our options for the future, so that we do have the option to change our genetics from a ranching standpoint. We change our genetics, we change our operation in one way or another, or we tweak it a little bit here and there. If you have the option to do that, you're more sustainable, for whatever that means, than you are if you don't have those options. And so what I don't know is where those conversations are going to go, or maybe where they'll end up, or what we need to be talking about inside that realm of conversations. But I really think we have to start using the term, maintaining options for the future. And there's a number of ways we can get at that, and ecosystem services can play a role in that. Maybe that's some of the options that we want for the future. We certainly want the options to be able to hand our ranch over to, our kids or our grandkids. And so why don't we manage in ways that allow us to have those kinds of options, whether it's on an ecosystem basis or an economics basis. And those things are so tightly linked, as John has talked about already. Those things are so tight, and the social aspect are so tightly linked, it's hard to imagine one without the other. But I think that's where the conversation needs to go, is management that maintains our options for the future. That's my 2 cents worth of it anyway.
It's really exciting conversation, and I appreciate all 3 of your takes on this, because what I'm hearing and what I think we'll see moving forward is sustainability is a term that seems to be around for the duration, but sustainability means not being afraid of it and talking about the future, the options, the ranch as a unit, what we provide to the economic, the social, and the ecological aspects. So I really, really appreciate your guys' input on that, and think that'll be helpful to all of us that are listening in here. So switching gears just a little bit, Dr. Tanaka, I'd like to go towards your study, your paper that you talked about a little bit, because we've had a lot of conversation around sustainability and conservation practices set to just achieve one objective or another, and a lot of times they get focused on private lands. I know on the Sustainable Rangeland Roundtables meetings that I've sat in on, that's always been one of the challenges, is that we have to acknowledge that 2/3 of the rangelands are privately owned, and investments on private rangelands are important because that leverages success. But we also need to, especially those of us in a county like mine that's similar to Nevada's capacity of public lands, we need to be able to translate that to implement successful practices on public lands. And you published a report last year, so talk to us a little bit. Allie is going to put the name of the report in the chat so that you can all have that information. And in the interest of time, we'll have her do that. But Dr. Tanaka, talk to us a little bit about the concept of ecosystem services, and maybe quickly walk us through the report and how you calculated some of the values on our public lands, our federal land.
Okay, so again, from the Sustainable Rangelands Roundtable viewpoint and some of the work we've done over the years, we tend to take a very human-centric view of nature in terms of ecosystem services. In other words, it's kind of the joining of the natural world, the biophysical world, and the social and economic world. And so unless society wants something or can use something from nature, we tend to view it as not necessarily having a value that we can put dollars on in this case. But really it's the market and non-market goods and services that come from rangelands that we're interested in. In the study you're referencing, we looked at recreation, wildlife habitat, and open space, forage, but we could also have looked at quantity and quality of water and maybe some other things. We didn't look specifically at carbon markets, those kinds of things, but if such a market existed, and we knew what the relationship between rangeland soils and vegetation and carbon was, it could be incorporated into a model like this. So we really looked at federal forage or forage in general, the general services provided by rangelands, primarily biodiversity, and then some wildlife values. We used proxy data to get at those. So like, for example, on the federal forage, we used the private land lease rate published by NASS, National Ag Statistics Service, calculated how many AUMs there were on federal lands, and then the number of acres in federal allotments to come up with a dollar per acre. On the general services, we use the CRP grasslands rental rate as a proxy for what, in this case, we'll consider society willing to pay for not only grazing, but also plant and animal biodiversity. And then for wildlife values, we use the Fish and Wildlife Survey of recreation days and their estimate of net economic value for those recreation activities, and then just divided that by the non-metro, non-urban acres in each. We did this for the lower 48 states, each of the states, and then for all 48 states together. And just to give you an idea, because we're using some NASS data, had to use the Census of Agriculture, which is, is only published every 5 years in the 2 and 7 years. And so in 2017, based on that, estimated that the value on federal land that was added by those 3 ecosystem services was about $370 per cow and $673 on private land. And so a total of $1,043 per cow in the US's, the lower 48 anyway. So that's, just an approach we took to try to estimate what the value of those ecosystem services were, what it added to a beef cow that's out in each state as a piece of information. I don't know if you have anything else you want to ask about that. Or...
I think that's perfect for right now. And when we get to the questions and answers, certainly if people have questions, please keep those ready. But I'd also like to tell you that look in your chat box, because we put the link to that report, and appreciate, Dr. Tanaka, all the work you're doing, because as we all know, Dr. Perryman said it too, but science rules. If we don't have the data to back it up, then it's just anecdotal. So appreciate all that work. And again, check your chat box and the information is there for that. So kind of following up on this with Dr. Perryman, you just published a paper that's going to be featured in the May version of Rangeland Ecology and Management. Any of you who are members of the Society for Range Management will be able to locate that too. You revisit some of the conclusions of Mack and Thompson that were done nearly 40 years ago, and they built the foundation for the opposition of grazing activity in certain plant communities. So building off of that. And the abstract says directly that sagebrush and salt desert shrub systems in the Great Basin and Intermountain West are complex, which those of us who live there know, and we need to be able to account for the complexity in order to be able to accurately manage, not just for ecological, but also for the economic and social properties. So again, we're on that ecological, economic, and social, which we keep coming back to. So would you talk to us a little bit about how the current discussions around ecosystem services framed your thoughts on this paper?
Well, it's taken me 20 years to sort of, with my colleagues and I, to kind of put our thoughts, gather them up to the point where we thought we could present it in a way that makes sense to folks. And the easiest sort of model or example, once again, that I can use to sort of initiate our thought process on it. And by the way, that paper is open access, so anybody can have access to it. You don't have to be a member of SRM or anything else. You can access that paper. We paid for so that everybody can have access to it that wants it. So back to sort of this idea of complexity and accounting for complexity. Here's a great example of how that is not done quite frequently. And I put it this way, and this may be one of the next papers that we come up with, but grazing is not a noun. If there's no such thing as grazed or not grazed, but so often we see, even in some of the ecological research, we will see models put together where rangelands are either grazed or they're not grazed. Well, unless you tell me something about how it was grazed, the timing, the duration, and the intensity, you're wasting everybody's time. If you don't tell me that, then you don't know if you're measuring something that happened 100 years ago during the legacy grazing period, or whether contemporary management is the driving force for what you measured. You don't know. And so it confuses everyone and confuses the whole understanding of the grazing process. There's timing, there's duration, and there's intensity to it. And it's complex. Grazing is a complex process. And boiling it down to this on-off switch, yes or no, doesn't help. And so we have to account for that complexity, even though, it may only be one or two more levels above what we're dealing with now, or what level you're dealing with now in any kind of contemporary management. You still have to account for that complexity. In Mack and Thompson's paper, which was published in 1982, one of the things that they did as evidence that the Great Basin and the Intermountain West was not adapted to grazing, and therefore everything bad that's happened in the world in the Intermountain West over the last century as a result of the introduction of livestock into the area. What they did was they used a single species east of the Rocky Mountains and a single species west of the Rocky Mountains to make broad inferences about complex ecosystems. And that's like taking a child east of the Mississippi River and a child west of the Mississippi River, and making broad sweeping generalizations about children either side of the Mississippi River. That makes no sense at all to anyone. And yet that's basically what their paper did. They used blue grama east of the Rockies, and they used blue bunch wheatgrass west of the Rockies. And so we went back through in the paper and we looked at all the evidence that they suggested, and we used more contemporary science, and we used some of the science that they ignored or left out, or both, at the time of the writing in 1982. And they just did not, everything is just this big oversimplification of these complex systems. And we hope that we did a good job updating that and trying to move our management paradigm more toward a forward-looking management paradigm instead of a rearward-looking management paradigm. And that's most of our management paradigm. That, you know, range reform is certainly affected by Mack and Thompson. And the idea is that if we manage it in an appropriate way, it will become something that it used to be. Well, we know that invasive species aren't going to get back on the boat and go back to the Mediterranean, right? We know that we've been in a warming period since the end of the Little Ice Age. We know that we've got more CO2 in the atmosphere now than we had, 100 years ago. So there's some things that have changed, and unless you can go back, and recreate Little Ice Age climate patterns and the CO2 that was in the air at the time, you can't go backwards and manage something so that it'll become what it used to be. So we need to turn forward and look forward once again, and as for our management paradigms, and say, what do we want in the future? And that is, once again, we get back to this idea of maintaining options for the future and sustainability. So that's the crux of the paper that we've written. Is we've updated a lot of things, and we've made a new suggestion. It doesn't do any good in the scientific world to just criticize somebody. You have to have another idea. And so the other idea that we've offered is this outcome-based management and managing for options for the future. And what do we want ecosystems to provide in the future, rather than what can they provide us if we manage them so that they are some semblance of what they used to be 100 years ago or 200 years ago, which we know is just, it's ridiculous. You can't be 12 years old again. And even if you could be 12 years old again, you can't make everybody else and everything around you be like it was when you were 12 years old again. And so it's just but that's our management paradigm that we've been under for the last 40 years anyway. And so hopefully I haven't confused everybody in this whole thing, but that's what we've been thinking lately, I and some of my colleagues, and hopefully that conversation is going to continue into that future realm instead of these oversimplified castigations of what ecosystems used to be and managing so that we could somehow or another achieve that. Is just inappropriate. And we published another paper a couple of years ago. A great example of that is all of our management in the Intermountain West is designed around the health and welfare of the deep-rooted perennial plant. And so we've done that, and we did that quite well, but we never stopped to wonder what the effect on the invasive annual grasses would be from that management. And obviously we've seen it. We've got more invasive annual grasses than we've ever had. So the management that's been going on certainly has fostered the increase of some of our invasive annual grasses. So I'll leave it with that. I've talked long enough. Back to you, Brenda.
Okay, I just muted myself and now I'm unmuted. Appreciate that and are really excited about this, and also appreciate the fact that you guys have this out here and it's available to everybody. So if y'all check your chat box, we also provided a link to that paper, and I think it sounds like something every one of us should read. And the other thing that, again, I really appreciate all of you is you keep talking about future. And that is probably the biggest thing, is making sure that we're all here for the future, because we are a key component of this. So moving into the next thing, conversations about carbon storage often lead on to conversations about how to increase the carbon storage potential and also how to do it economically. So measuring, monitoring, and monetizing the ecosystem services is one proposal, and policy and regulatory leaders are discussing this tremendously. In short, it becomes another carrot and stick conversation. And sometimes these are the kind of conversations that those of us making our livelihood on the ground get a little bit nervous about. So what the question we have here is, should mandatory practices be implemented where the government determines the best practices for increasing soil carbon? Or should we have practices that are incentivized to encourage producers to adopt those best practices? Certainly as a producer myself, and for others, I'm sure that having them incentivized so that we can choose the things that best fit the needs of our ecosystem in our area, our particular ranch, and the market that we are around. Again, not trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, but any one of us as ranchers, you could come and we do some things the same, but nobody does everything exactly the same, because we understand our ground. So how at the present, with the carbon markets that are developed and are focused largely on private ground or private land, where a practice can be implemented and a result can be measured, do we have enough information for federal lands to be a part of these marketplace discussions? And what is it going to take for us to be involved in these conversations? So Dr. Sawyer, let's go to you and see what, that's a big old question, a big old mouthful of a lot of things around it. So go ahead.
Well, that is a really big question, or set of questions all rolled up into one. You know, I'm not trying to pick and choose as much as just maybe put them in some priority order. You know, really one thing that as optimistic as I am about opportunities that are in front of us, something that you mentioned that I think is worth following up on is the concept of you know, measurement and monitoring. And a real challenge that exists in the space, strictly speaking, in the space of carbon storage, particularly through land management practices, you know, so grazing as a great example, is our capacity to actually measure meaningful change. You know, we don't know a whole lot about the spatial variability that currently exists in terms of soil carbon. Like, what is the current level of carbon that exists? We have ideas, we have samples from different places, but we don't know a tremendous amount about the dynamics of that. The evidence that does exist would suggest that carbon flux on Western rangelands is incredibly dynamic. And so when we start thinking about trying to monetize those quantitatively, anything that varies, you know, it's like cattle prices, right? So if they vary substantially around some average, then that implies risk, right? If you're betting on the average, then half the time you're wrong. And so I would say that before we are too enthusiastic about the potential rewards or incentives that might exist, some real attention needs to be paid to how these things are going to be measured and what levels are important. You know, as a kind of as an example, you know, if you know a round number, right? If we could accumulate 50 kilogram per acre of additional carbon because of the sheer number of acres involved in U.S. rangelands, 50 kilogram per acre times all of the rangeland acreage in the United States is a big number. And that's a number that you know is potentially meaningful in terms of greenhouse gas inventory reporting, for example. But 50 kilograms on an acre is about, you know, 50 parts per million. And if you take a soil sample and send it in and measure soil organic carbon, and let's say you're running it around, you know, 0.75%, right? Plus or minus 0.25%. I mean, that's the laboratory measurement isn't sensitive enough to detect the size of change we're talking about, 50 parts per million. And so we have the problem of multiplying small numbers by big numbers, right? Means that we get big numbers, and those are exciting to us in terms of opportunity. But to be able to actually measure those discreetly and reliably at landscape scale is currently a challenge that I don't think we have the best answer to. Within a single, we're working on a project right now, you know, on a single ranch, and I mean, it's, you know, substantial ownership in terms of private land scale, but within that one ranch, if the variability in soil carbon is 80% site to site, then how many samples do we need to take to determine that we made a 0.0005% change? And it's the cost of sampling to quantitatively define that, you know, with statistical reliability is so much that it's inconceivable that there's an amount of money that a unit of carbon would be worth that would cover the sampling cost if we're held to that standard. And so again, I'm kind of an eternal optimist, right? So I'm not trying to put anything sour in anybody's mouth, but I think this notion of or the ideas around these things and how they're going to be measured or monitored is something that's so central to the conversation. We need not overlook it in our excitement about the potential. And then, you know, kind of as maybe a more direct answer to parts of your question, you know, I think that this notion, though, leads us in some ways maybe to frame our thinking about what are appropriate structures. You know, is it a practice-based structure? And there's certainly movement toward that, you know, that we incentivize certain practices because we believe them to be most likely to achieve an outcome that's desired. And there's a whole lot of ifs and maybes and possibilities in that sentence. So kind of to go back to Dr. Perryman's opening comments, if there is a current belief that a best practice exists or a change in practices would confer this additional benefit, then I'm all for supporting an incentive to have producers adopt that change with the full knowledge that some measurement following that change is going to be required in order to verify whether that practice was in fact beneficial. And so I would say that we need to make sure that we do, again, borrowing from Dr. Perryman, leave the options open. What if I'm provided incentive payment to adopt a grazing strategy because the data that are available indicate that it might be beneficial? And so I implement the practice, And due to follow-up monitoring, I cannot verify that it was indeed beneficial. It probably wasn't detrimental, but I didn't achieve the level of positive change that could be measured. Am I free to then go back to my previous practice? In other words, have I closed an option by accepting the first option? And I think that as we think about the various structures that might exist, that this idea of future comparison, being willing to accept that not all of the things we think are going to work in the way that we think they are, and being able then to take additional steps and innovate in these spaces, really, I guess, to me, is an important feature of any policy discussion. You know, how do we leave those future options open to innovation? How do we determine that we really are making progress or achieving the outcome that's desired? And how do we make sure that we don't accidentally impose penalties on people who are willing to try? And I think that's, you know, I don't necessarily know the answers to those questions, but those are certainly things that are on my mind, even as we talk about engagement in various market structures or in practice-based incentive plans.
Okay, I really appreciate that, Dr. Sawyer, and again, really like the fact that you're bringing in the word future into this conversation. So, Dr. Tanaka, and then Dr. Perryman, we'll go to you. If we could just real quickly get your guys' take on this. The question: do we have enough information for federal lands to be part of these marketplace discussions? And what would it take for us to get involved in the conversation? So Dr. Tanaka, let's go to you, and then we'll go to Dr. Perryman.
I guess I personally don't believe we have enough information for a lot of the reasons that Dr. Sawyer just mentioned. You know, I know Nils is on here and probably recalls when we brought some deputy chiefs out to tour Western ranches several years ago when they were implementing their soil health program. And most of their information was based on what they were collecting from small fields in the east on croplands. And you know, you take them out to a Western ranch, 1 million acres, and you say, okay, so how are you going to measure soil health or changes in soil health on this? You know, where your information is based on maybe 1 or 2 soil types in a field, and now you're looking at 1 million acres and how many soil types are there on this. And we know each soil is going to be different and respond to changes in management differently. And so just having that information is going to be difficult to ever get, I think, you know, unless Barry or someone comes up with a great remote sensing process to be able to get that. You know, the other thing I'd say, you know, you talk about incentives are mandatory. You know, as an economist, to me, incentives are the way to go. They're more efficient. But again, the devil is in the details of how you set that sort of incentive process up, as Dr. Sawyer was talking about. You know, if you incentivize ranchers to do something, they have to determine if for themselves if it's going to be economically and socially acceptable for their operation. And if things move in the right direction, then it's all great. If you go to a mandatory system and you require that of everyone, you know, it's just not going to work because, again, each system is a little bit different. And so I guess I'll leave. Well, let me add one more thing. You know, I said the devil's in the details. And as you know, Brenda, that I've spent, I guess, most of my career working at the ranchers trying to get the information needed for analyzing policy changes. And that's been a challenge. And I certainly understand privacy issues, concerns about getting the information in the wrong hands on individual ranches. But that becomes a challenge in developing those sorts of details of a carbon market that's going to work for individual ranchers. If we don't know how individual ranchers are going to respond to these sorts of changes or what changes they foresee on their own operation, makes the science part of it very difficult. And I'll just throw that out there. not just on this sort of project, but on other ones we've done in the past. I'll turn it over to Barry at that.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tanaka. And yeah, Dr. Perryman, if we could get a quick, your quick thoughts on that, and then we'll have a few minutes left for some questions if anybody's got them.
Well, I would echo my colleagues' thoughts here. If you're out on the raggedy edge, pushing the envelope, you need flexibility. And if you're constrained by some rigid government regulation or framework, you lose that flexibility. I mean, that's just the way things work. And so, you know, I always remember when I talk about these kind of things, I remember Gene Kranz and Apollo 13 and the designers of the LIM. They said, well, it wasn't designed to do that, Gene. And he said, I don't care what it was designed to do. I want to know what it can do. So, like I said, if you're out on the raggedy edge, you need all the flexibility that you can get within reason to be able to shift and move and duck and dodge and so on. And if you're constrained by, once again, you're constrained by government system hierarchy that, you know, says you must do this, then that doesn't allow you to do that. And so, yeah, incentivization, I think, is probably would create more of that flexibility. So.
Well, I sure appreciate all of you with your input here and for all the panel discussion. Caitlin, I think we've set a really good stage. This conversation isn't going to go away soon. So I think we've got a really good stage for our PLC annual meeting to have some further conversation and to bring in the topic to further go on to incentives and also some monitoring aspects. But with that, I would like to open it up, and if anybody's got a question for the panelists, we've got just a few minutes here that we'd like to take. You can either go in chat or you can raise your hand, and I'll look here. It's talking about here. We've got one here from Mindy. I agree, we don't have enough information, but there's a need for applied science with implementation as part of policy. Could there be an outcome objective to maintain or increase carbon sequestration, allowing for various options with monitoring to be included in the policy? So, and then she says, we also, how do we communicate this in a social media soundbite? And I think that's a good point. So, Dr. Perryman, do you have any thoughts on this, on monitoring in a policy, and then also on a soundbite?
Well, anytime you monitor something, you have to have the ability to, to detect a measurable response. And, carbon sequestration, as it's already been mentioned, is a difficult one because on any rangeland setting, if you have a 1.5% of organic matter, we consider that a pretty good deal. And so how are you going to measure that over, look at these mountains, the mountains behind me here. The soil's different here versus, here versus here versus here versus here. And they're minuscule. So once again, as Dr. Sawyer was talking about earlier, how many samples do you have to take in order to, to get some kind of a realistic understanding? And so some of these ecosystem services are just, right now, we don't have the ability, we just don't have it to account for the complexity on that level. We can make some general ideas, or we have some general ideas and move in some general directions that we think are appropriate, but some of the things are just, boy, it's just tough. We can't know everything all the time. And so, as John knows, with some of this these economic things that they've been trying to analyze. So maybe there's something else that's more appropriate that is a surrogate, or that can serve as a surrogate that we can measure, that would serve as a surrogate for, soil carbon storage.
So Brent, if I could just tag on to Barry's comment there in response to the questions that have been posed. I think it makes a lot of sense if we all admit that really we don't know enough to be able to make definitive statements or recommendations or write prescriptions on how to fix everything. But what we do know is that we have some sense of direction. We would like outcomes to look like this, and we can envision possible interventions that might achieve those outcomes. And so maybe what we need to do is find a way to incentivize, as was stated there, applied science and innovation. Build that into a policy framework that says, okay, equip ranchers and maybe grazing associations with the linkages to academia and other research entities, in the academic community or within ARS or both, that encourage and incentivize innovative practices with appropriate controls and measures to determine, right, to start to gather the information that's required. And so rather than thinking about it as provide an incentive to adopt practice X with absolute inflexibility, which tends to be how those policies get drafted, instead create a policy that encourages innovation and helps every ranch in the United States become a laboratory so that they can make discovery and identify practices that work for them, but do it in a way that allows that information to be communicated effectively and encourages innovation among others, rather than saying, copy me, use my idea to create your own best idea. That would be a bit of a departure from federal lands management policy, but I think that it's one that both on private and public lands could encourage positive change while promoting and sustaining economic viability of individual operators.
Yeah, can I just jump in a little bit as well? Okay, sorry, Caitlin. And what Dr. Sawyer was just mentioning just kind of clicked some things in my head. With invasive species, when we were doing the national assessment, we were trying to get a handle on invasive species across the country on rangelands. And there is no good database, but it's all based on citizen science that goes to University of Georgia and their Bugwood database. And so if you could come to agreement on what you would monitor, what you would ask ranchers or agencies to collect, and created a national database to store that, it's not, I guess, science in the traditional sense of an experiment, with control, but you start collecting information across the landscape, across the nation, that it becomes almost a preponderance of the evidence, I guess, would be a way to look at it. So, just something to think about.
And Dr. Tanaka, I think that's a great point, and actually you went where I was going to go. I mean, really what you're all talking about, and why we asked the three of you here today, really to Dr. Sawyer's point, you are like-minded individuals, but you also have your own niche in this conversation, whether it's the economics, whether it's the plant and soil biology, or whether it's the animal biology, and how we take a look at the, from the emissions perspective and for the emissions capture potential of some of these conversations. There's a lot of text going on in the chat. I'm getting a lot of text messages here about, and really it's this balance of, we collect all of this data through monitoring. Not everybody does the same monitoring or the same intensity of monitoring, but we collect all of this data. So we have a collection of information, but then we have a dearth of information in another area. And then we've been focusing on reproducible science rather than novel science. And so it's put this we were sort of in this fits and starts scenario where we have a lot of information in one area, virtually nothing in the second column, and then we have a policy conversation and a scientific conversation that it is perhaps ahead of the balance of these first two areas. And so your perspective here is invaluable, and thank you for participating in this panel. We have two raised hands. I'm first going to go to Joe Guild. Joe should be, I think he should be spotlighted here, and he looks like he's unmuted. Joe, go on ahead.
Yeah, I learned something since this morning. Thank you, Caitlin. So, I don't know, my question might take up all the rest of the time, but going back to something that was said by Professors Perryman and Sawyer early, this is a good time because the conversation is being undertaken by all different sides. We do have the positive story to tell, and to Barry's point, he's hopeful and optimistic that with the new administration, you know, these different scientific validations of what we do are available and maybe even receptive by the administration. So the question is for the average rancher, and I've tried to write about some of this stuff, it's really hard to get the information out of the academic bibliography and grab those nuggets that become the social media soundbite or whatever. But to have that conversation and to utilize the people who are actually doing the work on the ground, how do we get the information? You know, as all of you know, I think we have plenty of money in the Public Lands Council Trust, and I think we could utilize some of that money to get somebody to grab those nuggets out of the bibliography. But is that the right way to go? And you know, I wrote actually 1.5 pages of the question, so that's a digest of my own question.
So who wants to take a stab at that first? Dr. Sawyer?
So I'm gonna take a really quick shot because my best answers to long questions are short. So I think that a lot of what we have been working on recently, and this somewhat follows up on part of one of the questions in the chat too, is trying to find the data that we do have, and you know, whether it's through modeling exercises or other means, at least be able to draw the boundaries around certain elements of these systems. And so, you know, I hesitate a bit to say that we want to go and sort of cherry pick the things that fit my bias the most, you know, but to the degree that we can identify the data that we do have and at least use that to point us in a direction or draw the big box around things, identify the remaining questions, and be honest about what we don't know or where the error is large enough that it could go either way. I think that is how we need to be engaged in this conversation. And a good example of that is this question about, I'm going to call it carbon balance in grazing systems. You know, we get a lot of discussion. You know, I've certainly been involved in a lot of conversation about the emissions side of that. And is sequestration or uptake sufficient to offset those emissions? As we've mentioned, you know, the error around those measurements is really large on both sides. But if we can at least take the data that we do have and show that it's conceivable that the system is in balance, then that's a good starting place in that conversation. And we can at least do that and try to not be offensive, but not be defensive, right? About how we're engaged in that discussion. And I think that does then illustrate where applied science and ground truthing of some models perhaps is money well spent and effort well spent in order to try to narrow the box, right? We draw a really big box at first because that's the best we can do. And as we learn more and understand the questions, then we gain precision and draw it more narrowly. So hopefully that's at least an attempt. You know, it's agreement more than an answer perhaps, but maybe that's a way to think about it.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think that that is helpful. I think there is general agreement in this space, by and large, at least, that there is some investment that's worth being made and opportunities for investment in a variety of spaces and by a variety of individuals and groups. But it's helpful to hear that there's agreement by those of you who do the work as well. I'm going to go to John O'Keefe as well. It looks like we are working on promoting him. John, you just need to unmute. There you go. Your question?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. I've been listening to this carbon and grazing discussion for a fair little while now, and I only partially understand it. So this is really just kind of a little carbon 101. So if I take a plant community and through management change a cheatgrass monoculture to a healthy bunch grass system, have I sequestered carbon at that point, or do I have to maintain that condition over time and wait for that to change the structure of the soil before I've sequestered carbon?
Dr. Perryman, I'm looking at you. This is cheatgrass here.
I don't know that I have a great answer for you. Maybe. There's just a lot of questions that we don't know. And accounting for the complexity is the problem. Even though we know we have to account for it, sometimes it's a very, very difficult thing to do. What I would argue, and where this conversation has gone here just in the last few minutes, is we are at this moment in time where we've got a lot of like preliminary data that's going to send us in directions that we're going to investigate. So we can sort of have some ideas, come up with some thoughts around what our preliminary data may be telling us. But in the end, once we get into the boat and we start going down that river, it may not be the channel we want to go down, and we have to come back and rethink some things. But what I would say about this conversion is this, and this may be more along the lines of the big box that Dr. Sawyer was talking about. We know that these deep-rooted perennial grasses are the keystone species. They're the one that hold these ecosystems together. And, when you're dominated by deep-rooted perennial grasses, you've got a different fuel composition of all kinds of different fuel characteristics. And which, it even burns later into the year when we do get fire. So we have a say in what the conditions of those burns are likely to be. But if we just go to allow this stuff to go to, an invasive annual species, I've been talking about the cinder bowl, like the dust bowl. If we just continue to go down that pathway, eventually what we will have is we'll have a loss of those deep-rooted perennials. We know that. And then we get more fires, bigger fires, and then we start getting soil loss. And if you start losing soil, you've lost your options for the future. And so in a real broad, generic way, I can argue for deep-rooted perennial grasses and managing for those, but understanding at the same time that we have to pay attention to what we do out there, how that affects those invasive annuals as well. And without getting even into the carbon aspect of it, that makes sense to me. And it would make sense, I think, to anybody that, that had any kind of a thought process and understanding of ecosystems, these Western ecosystems. Deep-rooted perennial grasses are going to give us more options for the future than invasive annuals are. So I don't know if that answered it very well or not, but that's about the best I can do.
Well, I think both of you know that all three of us could get together and talk about the various ills of cheatgrass and some of the new work that's going on, and even the recent assessment that catastrophic wildfire, even the different kind of forage types and forage profiles, that smoke and those pollutants are so harmful not only to human health, but sort of for that pervasive particulate, air quality and atmospheric evaluations as well. But I know that we're getting folks into their afternoon choring time, and so we are going to bring this to a close. If we don't have any other questions, we'll give folks just another minute for questions as I hand the reins here back to Nels, our president.
Okay, one last call for questions. Okay, hearing none. I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank all our panelists and participants in the meeting today. We continue to learn and figure out how to use these new technologies. Unfortunately, at this stage of the game, we're usually able to go out and have a drink and a nice meal and chat about what we've talked about all day long. So maybe we can get some rhyme or reason out of it all, but we'll have to just do that on an individual basis now.